Good evening, uncles, aunties, brothers and sisters in the Dhamma. We are privileged to have with us Brother Billy Tan as our speaker for today under the K3 DHAMMANANDA Lecture Series 2014. Brother Billy Tan is a business development, consultant and professional trainer who has trained countless business professionals in more than 20 countries. Brother Billy is a certified master practitioner of the Neuro-Linguistic Programming, NLP, a certified Six Sigma Black Belt practitioner, and a certified clinical hypnotherapist. In recent years, Brother Billy has conducted several professional training programs for resident and visiting monks at the Buddhist Maha Vihara brickfields. In sharing the Dhamma, Brother Billy studies under the guidance of Venerable Dr. M. Punaji Maha and enjoys connecting findings from neuroscience and psychology to present teachings of the Buddha from a modern and scientific perspective. Currently, Brother Billy offers talks, seminars, workshops, professional trainings, programs to Buddhist community centers and charity organizations. Today, Brother Billy will be giving a talk on illusion, delusion, and deception. Thank you.
Good evening, Bhantes. Good evening, brothers and sisters in the Dhamma. It's always a joy for me to be back at the Buddhist Mahavihara and to share all the discoveries of the Buddha and also the research into scientific perspective of the Buddha Dhamma. One of the things I really enjoy doing is to look into the field of neuroscience and psychology to find evidence that support and reinforce the teachings of the Buddha. And I have never ceased to be amazed that all the new discoveries, all the latest discoveries that have come forth in just the last 50 years in the areas of neuroscience and psychology, just about everything that has been discovered is supporting the teachings of the Buddha. And today, with a happy heart, I'm very happy to share this with all of you. And the topic for today's sharing, illusion, delusion, and deception. For today, the synopsis of today's sharing is that sensory perceptions are unstable, unreliable, and they lead to illusions. When we talk about illusions, it is actually a perceptual fallacy. It is a fallacy of the perceptions. Memory, imagination, expectations shape our concept of reality. We call this shaping interpretation. We interpret what we perceive. And this interpretation also leads to another kind of fallacy, which is conceptual fallacy, otherwise known as delusions. So we're quite easily exposed to illusions and delusions in the environment. And finally, these illusions and delusions are actually what we think of as reality. Reality is a subjective experience. What is real for one person may not be real for another. That's why it is a subjective experience. Reality is your experience of the activities of the environment stimulating your sense organs, and then you form a notion of what is real and what is not real. So today's sharing, we're going to look into how these notions are actually very much illusions, delusions, and deception. All right? Why do I say deception? I'll explain that in a moment. So I've pointed out what is reality. So reality is a subjective experience, and this is where the deception comes in. Human beings generally are self-deceiving organisms. We like to fool ourselves into believing something we want to believe in. Right? And this is deception, basically. So let's explore the meaning of the term deception. What does deception mean? Now, the English dictionary as well as the American dictionary do not give a very good explanation of the meaning of deception. But Wikipedia, fortunately, has an excellent explanation of what is deception. It is acts to propagate beliefs that are not true or not the whole truth, as in half-truths or omissions. Don't we all sometimes like to engage in half-truths and omissions? Right? So that is really what deception is all about. We like to deceive ourselves often. Right? Now, there is a common saying like, oh, seeing is believing. That means you rely on your senses to see something, and when you see it, you believe it. That is not true. The average human being practices the opposite of that. And what is the opposite of seeing is believing? It is believing is seeing. When you begin to believe in something, you begin to find evidence to support your belief. That is what I mean by believing is seeing. When we see something, we don't accept it as real unless it is consistent with our belief. What we see that is not consistent with our beliefs, we reject it. So that is really what we normally practice. Believing is seeing. And this believing is seeing is a form of self-deception. We deceive ourselves because we have believed in something and we stick to our belief. We become so attached to our beliefs that everything we see that is consistent with the belief, we accept it. Anything we see, hear, smell, taste, and touch that is not consistent with the belief, what do? We reject it. So today, let's take a look at how we have really no control over a lot of these illusions and delusions. And deception basically lead to the belief in fallacy. Now, when we speak of fallacy, there are really two kinds of fallacies. So the two kinds of fallacies are, the first one is what we call perceptual fallacy. Perceptual fallacies are illusions. That means these are caused by the way our sense organs are being stimulated and the way the brain actually processes that information. You could say, in a way, illusions are not our own fault in that sense. It is not a misinterpretation of the mind, but rather something happening in the brain which is putting together the images and creating this illusion. So this affects our perception of sensory stimulus. And this is caused by the cognition of sensory stimulus. Right? The second type of fallacy is conceptual fallacy, which is called delusion. That means the concept of reality is warped. It is not according to what has been perceived. This is caused by the affective process in the mind, which is the emotional mind. Okay? I will explain in a moment. The mind is made of two kinds of processes, the emotional process and the conscious rational process. So it is the emotional process of the mind which begins to associate and interpret certain perceptions, and this interpretation draws from our memory, our imagination, and our expectation. And this leads to a mental proliferation. Mental proliferation means the mind goes into a process where it begins to mix things up. It begins to confuse itself. It begins to think about things which is beyond what has been perceived. So that is mental proliferation. And this begins to affect our concept of reality. So every person reacts differently to these conditions. That's why reality is a subjective experience. My concept of reality may not be the same as your concept of reality, and that may not be the same as the concept of reality of the person next to you. So every one of us has our own concept of reality. That's why reality is a subjective experience. Let's take a look at illusions and delusions. This is a very good one. Illusion basically is not the mind playing tricks, it's really the brain playing tricks, the way the brain processes the signal and informs the mind that this is what you have just seen. Take a look at this image on the screen. Focus on any intersection and you will see a white dot. The white dot is there. Right? The white dot is real. It is there. It is actually there. Focus on one white dot for a moment and begin to notice what happens in your peripheral vision. What do you see? Let me hear from some of you. Black dots. And they are popping up and disappearing, popping up and disappearing. Who does not see the black dot? Raise your hand. I don't think, you don't see the black dot. Oh, okay. Tomorrow morning, I suggest you go and see an optometrist and have your eye examined. Or I have to bow to you with a deep bow. Focus on an intersection and see the white dot. And then notice in your peripheral vision, black dots popping up. Brother, are you able to see it now? No. Okay. Doesn't matter. So we have one who, I must give him a good bow on this one. Okay. So this is static illusion, right? And static illusion simply means when you look at something, it appears, it disappears. It is there, static. You know, it is a static image. It appears and disappears. That is static illusion. Let's take a look at a second kind of illusion called dynamic illusion. Focus on the center of this image for 5 to 10 seconds. And having focused on the center of this image for 5 to 10 seconds, begin to look around the image. What do you notice? What do you notice about the image? Sorry? It's moving, right? It appears to be moving, but I can assure you, brothers and sisters, Bante, this is a fixed image. Nothing is moving. There is no trick in this. It is your brain that is composing and constructing this image. This construction process actually is part of the Panchakanda, we call it the 5 aggregates. The construction process is the Sankara, the Chitta Sankara, how the brain constructs images from what the eye, the stimulation of the eye. So this construction process actually produces some flaws, right? So this is a dynamic illusion. Now let's look at a third kind of illusion, which is an interactive illusion, not what you're seeing now, but in a moment when I play the video, okay?
Let's start with this illusion. Stare at the X in the middle of the image. Do you see the green dot moving around in a circle? Now try to follow that green dot with your eyes. Nothing there, right? This illusion helps demonstrate how quickly your brain finds motion in your surroundings.
So, brother, do you see the green dot? The one who couldn't see the black dots just now. Are you able to see the green dots just now? Yeah. See, when you stare at the center, it appears there are green dots following that empty space. All right? Who doesn't see the green dot? Do we have anyone who doesn't? Okay. You know what I'm going to say if you raise your hand. Tomorrow morning. Okay. Now, this is an interactive illusion. These are illusions beyond your control because your brain is doing it, not your mind. You're not your thinking. Right? It is the way the brain constructs the image from the stimulation of the light-sensitive cells at the back of your retina. You see, the retina is made of light-sensitive cells. And light going in is stimulating the light-sensitive cells. 100 million of them continuously feeding information to the brain. And the brain tries to process that. And this processing is fairly complex. And in this processing, there is some flaws as a result of the way the image is structured. So it's not really your fault, okay? But everyone will see those illusions. Now let's look at another kind of fallacy. Right? Let's begin. Imagine I think I would like to ask some young men, okay? What do you notice in this image? Maybe Nathan is a young man. What do you notice in this image? Yeah, the one that is circled. You don't see the what has been circled. Okay, we try someone. Brother, what do you see? The one that is circled? A lady. Okay. Let's get closer. Huh? Let's get closer. All right? So as you get closer, you begin to imagine, oh, that's a nice lady with what kind of hair? Long hair. Oh, you want to get close to her? Now you want to get to know her. Right? A lady with long hair. and you want to get to know her. Okay? So, this kind of fallacy is really a conceptual fallacy. Yeah? It is your mind playing tricks on you, not the brain anymore. Don't blame the brain. Yeah? It is your mind. This is believing is seeing. You believe it is a young girl or a lady, and you begin to perceive that, oh, what you're seeing is the image of a lady as we get closer. But then you realize the reality is not what you have been looking at. Believing is seeing, right? And this is delusion. Believing is seeing is delusion. You believe in something and you begin to find evidence to support your belief. First, you believe it is a young lady or a lady walking there, and then you begin to imagine that it must be really a lady, and as you get closer, suddenly you realize it is not. So this is believing is seeing. So these are fallacies. So let's take a look at the explanation behind all this. The subjective experience. Our concept of reality is driven by our subjective experience. And each and every one of us has a different set of subjective experience. Our mind interprets our experiences based upon a number of vital factors. And what are these factors? First, it is our present circumstances. It depends on our present circumstances. It's a combination of all these factors, not just one. And it is our beliefs. And that's what I mean by believing is seeing. It is the memory of past experiences that help us interpret our experience that we are experiencing in the present moment. And it is our imagination of future outcomes that is affecting our interpretation. It is also our expectation of present demands, what we expect or what we demand, what changes we demand to the present moment. It is also our attention system. Are we paying attention or not? And it is also the environmental conditions, various conditions in the environment stimulating our sense organs and how our sense organs react to it. And finally, it is our mental conditioning, right? And this mental conditioning I'm going to talk about, this is something that our mind does unconsciously, right? We are not aware of it if we are not mindful. So the bottom line is basically, if you are not a mindful person, these things will happen to you. Deletion, generalization, and distortion. We're going to talk about that a little bit more later on. And finally, it is also dependent on psychosomatic conditioning. Psychosomatic is referring to the intertwined connectivity between the mind and the body. Psycho refers to the mind, the way the mind is perceiving. Somatic refers to the body, the soma, how the body reacts. The mind and the body in a normal human being, they are interconnected. What you think affects how you feel. How you feel affects what you think. They are intertwined. And this is very often inseparable. But if you practice meditation well and practice mindfulness, then of course you can have some control over it, but not total control over it. So basically, these are the conditions that affect the way we interpret our circumstances, the way we interpret the experiences we are encountering every moment, from moment to moment. So let's explore some of this. Now, when we speak of the word mind, it seems a very confusing word. What is mind? Right? Mind is a big word. When I ask one person what is mind, that person might say, the way I am thinking. And I ask another person what is mind, it could be, the way how I interpret it and how I feel about it, and so on. But we don't have to be so perplexed. The Buddha gave us the answer already. The Buddha described the mind with 3 words very specifically. These are the 3 parts of mental experiences. The first word the Buddha uses is vijnana. Vijnana basically is a product of the process of perception. Now, the proper translation of this word, according to my teacher, Venerable Dr. Punaji, is that vijnana is perception. Very often, if you read Buddhist books, you will find the word vijnana being translated as consciousness. Well, in a way, if you call consciousness as the awareness of perception, then that is correct. But in the field of psychology and in the field of neuroscience, consciousness has a slightly different meaning. Consciousness actually means the awareness of a self in the world. That means consciousness comes with the notion of a self existing in the world. Now, vijnana does not refer to that. The correct term from the field of psychology and neuroscience is perception. So vijnana is really, technically speaking or scientifically speaking, perception. When you perceive something, that means when your sense organs have sensed something and now you have a mental image of what has been sensed. That is vijnana. This is not about having a sense of self, right? So that is vijnana. We're going to explore a little bit about that in a moment. The second word that Buddha uses to describe the mind is mano. Mano, scientifically, is the cognitive process, or cognition, some will call it. Mano, as a cognitive process, is really the categorized interpretation of perception, giving meaning to what was perceived. We're going to explore that in a moment. The third word Buddha uses to describe the mind is chitta. Chitta is actually the affective process. Right? From psychology and neuroscience, it is really the affective process, which is a common term used to describe what is commonly called emotions. Right? So it is the arousal of emotion leading to mental proliferation. That means the mind begins to wander beyond what has been perceived, interpreting more than what has been seen, heard, smelled, tasted, or touched. And in that process of interpretation, it is also the personalizing that experience. Personalizing the experience with the notion there is a self to be affected. Right? So we're going to explore these three, how it is happening in the mind. Because the word mind by itself can be very confusing. It is really described by the Buddha with these three words. Right? So now when we see any Buddhist books that uses the word mind, do be a bit cautious about whether it is talking about mano or chitta. Usually it is mano or chitta. Wherever mano or chitta appears, then it is commonly translated as mind without distinction. Right? Whereas where the word vijnana appears, it is translated as consciousness. Okay, basically mind arises as an activity, as a result of the activity. Mind arises as a result of the activity of the central nervous system. So scientifically, what is the central nervous system? The central nervous system is made of two major components, the brain and the spinal cord, which is connected to various parts of the body. Right? So in the spinal cord, it is connected to the peripheral nervous system, which is then connected to the sense organs. It carries information to the brain. Whenever any of our sense organ is stimulated by the environment, by environmental activities, it carries that information to the brain. And the brain begins to process it. And after processing it, the brain sends instruction to the rest of the body to react to it, one way or another. So that is really how this central nervous system is working. And that actually is how we are actually functioning in our daily life. Our sense organ pick up stimulations from the environment. That information is relayed to the brain processes it, and then as a result of this activity of the central nervous system, the mind arises. Now the mind arises in three ways. First, having a perception of what has been stimulated, that perception is vijnana. Secondly, being able to process that and interpret that rationally, that is mano. And finally, having an emotion about it and reacting to it emotionally, that is chitta. So let's look at what part of the brain is doing that. Right? Now, this part of the central nervous system, where the peripheral nervous system is connected to our sense organ, this is where the process of perception begins. And this is the vijnana part. Now, if we take a look at the brain itself, the brain evolved over millions of years into three major layers. The brain stem, which is our survival brain, responsible for keeping us alive through keeping our heart beating, keeping our lungs continuously processing the air, right? Respiration, keeping our digestive system to process the food that we consume, and so on. These are autonomic functions in the body which we can't really control, and it is happening all the time. The second part of the brain that has evolved is the middle part called the limbic system, and this is actually what is commonly called the emotional brain. This is where the emotional command center is. Right? This part of the brain is responsible for triggering various biochemical chain reaction in the body. I'll explain a little bit later what is emotion, because in the past, right, and 100 years ago, people used to think that emotion is purely mental. But today, scientists have all come to a consensus that emotion is not just something mental. Emotion is a combination of the mental as well as the physiological part. And the physiological part is affected by hormones. And these hormones affecting the body affects the way we think. And this whole process of affect is called the affective process. And that is what emotion is. And finally, the third part of the brain is the most recently evolved, which in human beings are the most advanced compared to other species. This is the cerebral cortex, commonly called the learning brain. And this is the part of the brain which is processing conscious, rational thoughts. All right? So let's take a look at how the processing happens. This limbic system is responsible for the affective process, which is a combination of both our emotional thoughts as well as hormones in the body affecting various organs in the body. And this affective process is chitta. The cerebral cortex is responsible for the cognitive process, and that is our rational interpretation of what we have perceived, and this is called mano. Right? Now let's take a look at how all this is happening in the mind. Let's take a look at perception, the most fundamental one, which is the beginning of it, and that is perception, what we perceive. Now I want you to tell me what you see. What do you see? What do you call this? Smiley? Yeah, a smiling face is a face. Okay? So you have remembered this as a face. You could not possibly have seen this image before. I made this up on the computer. Okay? So this is not copied from somewhere else. So this would be the first time most of you are seeing it. What is the next thing that you see here? A ladder. Okay. And then what do you see here? A hat. Good. Now what do you see here? A rolling ball, bowling ball. What else? Some say balloon. Good. Some call it a mouse also. Yeah. So you think it's a balloon, or you call it a balloon. Now what do you see here? Railway tracks, not ladder, right? Now, I want you to tell me by label or quickly, do you recognize this? What do you see? Oops, you can't. Why? Now I'll explain why. It actually was originally the hat, with the components shuffled around a little bit. See, every bit and piece of this diagram came from the hat. Similarly, what you thought you saw as the balloon or the mouse came from the smiley face. I just reshuffled that little smile to take it outside the circle and move those three little circles to the top right corner, and that's what it is. So it's actually the same image with just a couple of small little adjustments. Similarly, what you thought as what you call the railway tracks is really the ladder that is being slanted. That's what it is. So why are we doing that? You see, this is all part and parcel of the way we process perception, or the way the brain processes perception. Right? You could not recognize this because this image is not similar to anything else. The reason we recognize these images is because of categorization. We do not remember images specifically. We remember images in a categorized manner. We categorize them and remember what category it belongs to. So that a little red smiley you see is actually in the category of images we call smiley. So the moment you see something similar that resembles it, then you call it by the name of the category. That's why you call it smiley. Similarly, with the balloon, it looked like a balloon. It's similar to a balloon. So it belonged to the category of balloon, and you call it a balloon. Right? The same thing with the railway tracks and the ladder, because they belong to that category. So now let's explore how this is happening. The process of experience. Experience is really a chain reaction. When environmental activities begin to stimulate our sense organs, that means it is stimulating our ear, our eye, our nose, our tongue, and our body, it triggers the arising of what is called the panchakanda. Panchakanda is commonly translated as the 5 aggregates. And this 5 aggregate is continuously arising and falling away, arising and falling away, so fast, continuously, in order to process the stimulations from the environment. And in this processing, now I'm using the interpretation of my teacher, Venerable Dr. Punaji. It may not be the same as some of the way that has been described in books and commentaries. I go by what my teacher has taught me. So therefore, when this panchakanda arises, the vijnana, which is the perception that arises in the mind, that is the vijnana. We now have a perception of what has been stimulated through the sense organs. Right? A mental image arises. And this perception is vijnana as a result of the panchakanda. At the same time, when this panchakanda arises, there is sensation, sanya. Now, sanya is sometimes translated as the word perception, but actually, technically speaking, from a scientific perspective, sanya is really sensation. It is sensing something that has been stimulated by the environment. It is sensing stimulations of the environment. So it's really a sensation, not a perception, because a perception is having an idea what has been perceived. But sanya, at the point of sanya, there is no idea yet. So that is sensation. That sensation triggers a number of things. Right? Now, with this perception, we are able to see, hear, smell, taste, and touch. And that sensation, and this is actually perception. Now, let's take a look at the sensation part now. Right? That sensation part is part of the cognition process, the rational interpretation. So, when environmental activities stimulate our sense organs, it gives rise to this panchakanda, process of perception. And this process of perception arises to construct a vijnana, a perception of what we have just seen, heard, smelled, taste, or touch. And with that, the cognitive process arises, the mano arises. It arises to interpret what has just been seen, heard, smelled, taste, or touch. And this interpretation happens in a categorized manner, as I mentioned earlier. And this interpretation of categorized manner is called papancha. Right? And the interpretation gives meaning to what has been perceived or what has been cognized. And the meaning given gives rise to the idea that we now recognize something, a recognition. Right? The word Dharma here does not refer to the Buddha Dharma. It refers to the cognition, the reality of what has just arisen in the head, right? The perception. And we begin to interpret this and give it a meaning. So this meaning given is Dharma, right? The realization of something we have perceived, the realization of what it is. So let's take a look at how it all happens. The vijnana gives rise to this perception, and then the sanya triggers the cognitive process, mano. Sanya triggers the arising of the cognitive process, which then interprets what has been perceived by comparing it with categorized memory from past experiences. If you have seen something similar in a categorized manner, You will be able to recognize it. That's why you recognize the smiley, you recognize the balloon, you recognize the railway track, you recognize the ladder, the hat, but you did not recognize the last image I showed you, which was bits and pieces taken from the hat, because you did not see anything similar to that before. You did not see anything that fit into that category of what I showed you. So these are all in categorized manner. And at that point in time, right, the mind begins to want to know what it is. What is it that I have just seen, heard, smelled, taste, and touch? And that's what this papancha is trying to answer. Answer the question, what is this that I have just seen, heard, smelled, taste, and touch? Let's take a look at what the scientists are saying about this process, right? When we see a basketball, what happens? So this is how the scientists are explaining precisely what I'm calling papancha, or what my teacher tells me, right? This is papancha, the recognition of something that fits into the category.
Take a look at this object. One glance and you know what it is. But how do you know what it is and where it's positioned in space? Well, let's break it down. The light reflected by this object is converted by your eyes into an electrical signal and is sent down a neurological pathway called the optic nerve to the back of your brain. Starting in this region, called the visual cortex, the image is cross-referenced with memory of past experiences stored throughout your brain as you try to identify the object. Once it's figured out what it is, your brain has to decide how the object is positioned in space.
So basically, we recognize something because we have seen something similar and belonging to the same category. And this is how we remember things. We never remember things specifically. We always remember things in a categorized manner. Okay? Now the next part, the affection, right? The arousal of emotions and the reaction of the emotions. Affective process arises as an unconscious emotional arousal depending on meaning given by what was cognized. That means in the process of papancha, we've given a meaning to what has been seen, heard, smelled, taste, and touch, what has been cognized. And this meaning triggers the arising of this affective process called chitta. And this is actually the arousal of emotion, the beginning of emotion. And unconscious emotional arousal triggers a biochemical chain reaction in the body. Right? An autonomic biochemical chain reaction. Autonomic means it happens automatically within the body. It is not something that we can control. It begins in the brain, it spreads to the rest of the body. It's a biochemical chain reaction in the body. And this biochemical chain reaction affects organs, tissues, and tissues in the body. Various organs and tissues, and these organs and tissues begin to react in their own specific ways depending on what kind of hormones or what kind of biochemistry is happening. Biochemistry here is referring to hormones, enzymes, acids, and various chemical components that flood the body through the bloodstream, yeah? And they are released by glands in the body, various glands, adrenal gland, pituitary gland, various glands in the body, releasing these hormones. So this biochemical chain reaction affects various organs, causing the organs and tissues to react in some specific ways. For instance, when we are stressed, the stress hormone causes the heart to beat faster. It causes our respiration to deepen, so we begin to breathe more rapidly. It causes the body to perspire. It may even cause trembling. It may cause the rising of temperature in the body, and so on. All these causes are actually stressing the body, and they are called stressor. Stressor are conditions that stress the body. So let's take a look now at the next process. We have seen so far how perceptions arise, the vijnana, the first part of the mental experience. Then we have seen how the mano arises to interpret whatever has been perceived. That is the second part of the mental experience. Now, the third part of the mental experience is first triggered by the feeling of what has been stimulated. Our sense organ is being stimulated, and therefore there is a feeling, Vedana. Right? Vedana is the feeling of sensations stimulated by the environment. Environment stimulating our sense organs, and that stimulation causes a feeling. That feeling can be pleasant, it can be unpleasant, and it can be neutral. There are three states of this feeling. Whatever it is, it actually triggers the arising of the third mental experience, and that is chitta, the mental process. The chitta is the affective process. This is the beginning of emotions. This is the part of the emotion which is firstly mental, but at the same time, it actually causes a biochemical reaction in the body. It triggers unconscious arousal, which triggers biochemical reactions in the body. And this biochemical reaction in the body causes hormones to flood through the bloodstream, to flood the various parts of the body and affecting various organs. The way it affects this organ causes the organs and tissues, right, to behave in unusual ways, and this is actually causing tension in the body. This tension in the body is the physiological part of emotion, right, the bodily part of the emotion. So what happens is this: tension in the body gives rise to bodily sensation called feelings. Now this is emotional feelings, right? This is the feeling that is emotional because of the tension in the body. The feeling mentioned earlier in here, the Vedana, this is not an emotional feeling. This is purely a sensational feeling. That means when you sense something hot, you touch something that is hot, the touching of it, sensing the temperature, that is sanya, right? Therefore, it is sensation, not perception. Sanya is sensing the temperature. Now, this temperature, because it is very high, it gives an unpleasant feeling, a hot feeling, a feeling it is hot, right? This unpleasant feeling is Vedana. At this point in time, feeling this hot feeling is not emotional. It is purely sensational. You felt it is hot, that's all, right? The emotion comes later. The emotion comes here. It causes tension in the body. The heat causes the tension in the body, and that tension gives rise to that emotional feeling. Now, there is a bodily sensation. That bodily sensation is that emotional feeling, which we experience as pain, pleasure, excitement, fear, discomfort. And this feeling is dukkha. This is the feeling of discomfort, this feeling of unsatisfactoriness or dissatisfactoriness, the feeling of pain, also the feeling of pleasure. That's why Buddha has pointed out even pleasure is dukkha, okay? Because some things may appear to be pleasurable, but at the same time, they can hurt us in the long term, right? So basically, this bodily sensation is the feeling which is translated as dukkha, right? And when dukkha arises, we begin to personalize this experience. We personalize this mind-body experience, right? It is a psychosomatic experience, the mind-body connection. And this gives rise to the notion there is a self that is being affected by this experience. That's why this self arises. The self arises because we personalize this experience. Now, the process of personalization is called upadana. And sometimes the word upadana is translated as clinging. It is also translated as attachment. But actually, it is the personalization of the experience. We personalize it and say, this is me, this is mine, this is I. The I, me, and mine arises. Because we then imagine there is a body, there is a me and I to be affected by this experience. And that is why it is called clinging. We cling on to it. And that actually keeps the suffering continuous. It leads to the continuation of this dukkha. And when this clinging arises, we begin to react emotionally to the experience. And this reaction is called tanha. The word tanha is often translated as craving. Well, craving is a reasonable translation, but actually a more accurate scientific translation of the word tanha, according to my teacher, that is emotional reaction. We react emotionally. This emotional reaction is tanha. If we don't react emotionally, we will have no tanha. Without tanha, there will be no continuation of suffering. See, the suffering begins with this feeling in the body, but that is just the beginning. If there is no clinging and there is no reaction, that pain subsides. Pain is real. It arises, it falls away. But because we hang on to it, we say, oh, I am feeling painful. That thought, I am feeling painful, that makes that pain even worse. Okay? Because we are clinging to it. So how is that happening? Now, with this arising of the emotional process, the affective process, biochemical reactions happen in the body, then there is tension in the body because the organs are behaving in specific ways. That tension is dukkha, causing dukkha. And this is just the beginning of that suffering. But when we begin to attach to that suffering, when we begin to cling on to this idea, oh, I am feeling the pain, then that pain persists, and then that leads to the long-term dukkha. When we experience bodily sensation, the thing that comes to our mind is this unconscious thought. How does this affect me? You see, the me is there. That's when the sense of self arises. How does this affect me? Okay. So when that happens, memory, imagination, expectation kicks in. Then the mind begins to proliferate. At this point in time, the arising of memory, imagination, expectation is called mental proliferation. This is the time when we begin to want more of what is pleasurable. And this wanting more of what is pleasurable is lust and greed, called lobha. This is also the time when we begin to want to get rid of what is painful, what is uncomfortable. And wanting to get rid of or avoid what is painful or uncomfortable is a form of aversion and hatred. That is dosa. And when the feeling is neutral, neither pleasant nor unpleasant, we begin to have this delusional thinking that I am sensing something. I am sensing something. So there is an I, there is a something out there. And therefore the sense of self arises. The delusion that there is a self that is being affected by this conditioning, by these environmental activities. So that is moha. That is how lobha, dosa, moha arises, right? When the body begins to react to bodily sensations. And that is when we begin to have real suffering, right? Soka and parideva. Grief, lamentation begins. Now, these two actually correspond to the psychological explanation of suffering, which is general adaptation syndrome, commonly called stress. Right? Stress is also another translation of the word dukkha. Right? In fact, if you go to Access to Insight, you will find Thanissaro Bhikkhu likes to use the word stress, referring to dukkha. Right? Whereas many other authors or commentators like to use the word suffering to refer to dukkha. But stress is also another word being used to refer to dukkha. Scientifically, it's correct. It is stress. It causes bodily sensation. It causes the mind to be disturbed. All these are stress. Stress is a combination of both physiological as well as mental. So this is when suffering is propagated further. Right? It prolongs. Now, let's take a look at the next part, which is our unconscious mental conditioning arising as a result of all this. Right? You see, our mind conditions our experience. And this conditioning is something that we can't control directly. We can train our mind to not do the conditioning, but we can't control it, so to speak. It arises automatically. But why? because our 5 sense organs continuously sense and transmit to the brain enormous amounts of sensory information, of stimulation from the environment, constantly happening. Take, for example, just simply the eyeball alone. One eyeball in the retina. At the back of the retina, there are 120 million light-sensitive cells. These light-sensitive cells continuously transmit data to the brain. So imagine, whenever light hits these light-sensitive cells, continuously, there's 100 million signals going to the brain, non-stop, continuously going and going and going and going, because it's arising and falling, arising and falling, arising and falling. So the brain is being bombarded with so much information. And what I have just described is just one eyeball. What about the other eyeball? What about the surface of the skin? Again, millions and millions of touch-sensitive receptors. What about our tongue? What about our nose? What about our ear? The sounds we're hearing, right? So all this information is bombarding the brain. Our conscious mind is not capable of understanding or evaluating all the information coming into the brain. The brain is processing it. The brain can handle it. The brain receives it and processes it and begins to form notions. And that is the mind arising, but the mind is not able to process all this. Right? It is not capable of processing every single stimulus that the brain receives from our sense organ. Now, I'm going to ask a question specifically to the people in the back row. Right? All the people sitting in the back row, your eyeball would have captured the image of every single person in this room. True or not? The people in the front would not see the people at the back. But the people sitting in the back row, your eyeball would have captured the image of every single head in this room. But because it is bombarding the mind, your conscious mind is not able to process that information. The fact is, you have seen every person in this room, but the fact remains that your mind is unable to process it. If I ask you, how many people in this room? You can't answer that. Because your mind can't process it. It's too much information. And this is one of the characteristics of how the mind filters away information. So we're going to explore how the mind filters away information. Our conscious mind really can only pay attention to 3 or 4 different tasks apparently simultaneously, but actually only truly focus on one at a time. The mind is not multitasking. The mind can only focus on one thing at a time. But we may be able to do 3 or 4 tasks at the same time. Let's say a housewife in the kitchen. What is she doing? One hand is stirring the soup pot, boiling soup. The other hand might be frying an egg. Right? And then the radio is on, so the ears are hearing to a little bit of sound from the radio. But at the same time, the TV is on with Astro while I toy showing. And then you're watching a soap opera. So it seems like you are making soup, you're frying your vegetable, and then you are hearing the radio, and then you're watching the television. It seems like you're doing 4 different things at the same time. But actually, what your mind is doing is not managing 4 things at the same time. It is processing these 4 things sequentially at very high speed. Let's say we call these 4 different things as A, B, C, D, and we give more priority to A. So if you are enjoying watching the soap opera on the TV, your priority would be watching the soap opera. That would be A, right? And so on. So there are 4 different tasks, A, B, C, D. What is your mind doing? How is it processing A, B, C, D? This is what's happening. The mind is skipping from one to the other. It's going A, B, C, D, A, D, B, C, A, B, D, A. So it goes to A a lot more because you're paying more attention to that A. So the mind is actually jumping back and forth between these 4 tasks. But at any one moment in time, the mind is focused on only one task. That's it. That's why it is very dangerous to be driving and talking on the phone or texting at the same time. Because you think you're very smart, and I'm also a culprit of it. Driving, and then we bring the cell phone right in front of us. While we think we're seeing the road, we're looking at the phone trying to press a number to call. And that is actually, We think we are multitasking, but actually we are not. So easy that when your eye is focused on the phone for one fraction of a second, somebody dash across the road, you might end up hitting that person. The mind can only do one task at a time. The mind is not capable of doing simultaneously multiple tasks. But it is jumping, hopping back and forth. And it will pay more attention to the one which you are more attentive to, right? So you have to be aware, the mind is a single task process. Now, I want you to take a look at this, okay? And what is happening in your brain is that it is processing enormous amounts of information. One part of your brain is processing information about the various components of what you're seeing. The eye, the nose, right, the lips. Another part of your brain is processing different colors. Right, the red, the yellow, the black, the brown, the gray. Another part of your brain is processing the contours. Right? There's a shape of the scarf, there is a shape of the shoulders and so on. Another part of your brain is actually processing the shades, the darker shades, the lighter shades. Another part of your brain is actually processing the recognition of components. Recognition that there is an eye, there is a nose, there is a lips. Another part of your brain is processing individual letters in the words there. Another part of your brain is actually processing the meaning of that whole name of that person there. Another part of the brain is processing the recognition of this person, the complete face, who this person is. So your brain is actually processing so many things, but your mind can only focus on one thing. I'm going to prove it to you. I want you to take a look at her eyes, focus on both her eyes at the same time. Can you? Or are your eyeballs darting back and forth between the two eyes? You see, your mind can't see the two eyes at the same time. Your eyeball can, but your mind can't process it. So the mind pays attention to one eye, next minute to the next eye, back to the one eye, the left eye, the right eye, the left eye, the right eye. So that's why your eyeball is going back and forth. It's not because your eyeball can't do it. Your eyeball can. It is the mind that cannot do it. Yeah? So, do you agree with me, all of you? You are not seeing both her eyes at the same time. Your eyeball is darting back and forth, right? Okay. Some people will say, oh, the eyeballs are too far apart. Why don't we go to something nearer? Take a look at the nose. You have the left nostril, left nose and the right nose. Now, see whether your eye can focus on both sides of the nose at the same time. I assure you, you can't. It's also darting back and forth. And some people say, oh, well, the nose is apart. How about something right next to each other? And you know what is next to each other? Her Bugs Bunny teeth. Focus on the two front teeth. Now, this is what is happening for most of you. Either you are looking at the center line and then looking at both teeth with your peripheral vision, which means your mind is really focusing only on the center between the two front teeth. Or your mind is causing your eyeball to dart back and forth between the two front teeth. Either one of these two, right? You're still not able to see her two front teeth at the same time, even though they're right next to each other. You see? Because your mind cannot focus on two things at the same time. It can only focus on one thing at a time, and that is what is happening in your mind. So I hope this proves the point, that you are now realizing that your mind can only focus on one thing at a time. If you want something much easier to digest with what I'm saying, look at her name. Look at the first word, S-I-T-I. See if you can see the two I, the dots of the two I at the same time. You can't. You are either looking at the center and using your peripheral vision to figure out the two dots, or your eyeball is darting back and forth between the two dots. That's all it is. Your mind cannot do two things at the same time, right? So, the mind filters things out. Our conscious mind copes with this complexity by applying filter. to simplify and make sense of what we are perceiving. So the mind is trying to simplify what we are able to perceive. And this simplification comes with a process of deleting information, generalizing or compiling or categorizing information, or worse still, distorting information. So in other words, our mind actually tries to simplify what we perceive by one of these three processes. This is done by the mind, not the brain. The brain sees it all. But the mind will delete information by ignoring or leaving out details or a portion of the experience. Or it tries to generalize it by lumping it together, representing groups of experiences as the same class of experience, categorizing it. Or we're still distorting it, which is inaccurately representing in a simplified or limiting manner, a compromised manner. So let's take a look at how our mind is actually doing these things, right? Deletion, generalization, and distortion. Deletion. Here is an experiment when people are asked to focus on counting cars, and the mind is not able to see a gorilla walking by.
University of Illinois professor Dan Simons thinks that he has found a way to make a gorilla invisible. As this reconstruction shows, Simons can make an adult primate disappear right in front of your eyes. Or in this case, a student in a gorilla suit being filmed while taking a stroll up and down a busy street. A gorilla walking around the neighborhood is not an everyday sight, and it was hard for people not to notice a large hairy ape walking down the sidewalk. One guy took some photos. A few drivers honked their horns, and the cops pulled up to make some discreet inquiries. This gorilla was definitely not invisible. Next, a group of volunteers were invited to a screening of the gorilla film. The audience was told nothing about the movie, just instructed to count how many cars whizzed past on the screen. Then it was time for the world premiere of Gorillas in Our Midst. When the lights came back up, the audience members were asked how many cars they counted. They were also asked if they'd noticed anything unusual about the movie they had been watching.
Unusual? No, not really, no. No, I didn't notice anything.
No, I didn't.
Absolutely no one in the room noticed a gorilla walking down the street, even though it was clearly an attention-grabbing object in plain sight. It's like it disappeared right before their eyes.
We should have spotted it, but the aim was to spot the cars, not the things around it, so it was a bit more tricky.
You just don't see how you couldn't have seen it in the first time. It's a bit crazy.
How could so many people not see the gorilla? Professor Simons believes that when people are asked to concentrate on a complex task, they can suffer from a phenomenon known as inattentional blindness.
Their attention is focused elsewhere, and as a result, they just don't see things that are in their environment.
Simons theorized that people miss seeing what was right in front of them, such as a gorilla, because their brain was filtering out information to make their task more manageable. In this case, the volunteers did not register the gorilla because they were so focused on counting cars.
So you see, when you become so focused on doing one thing, the mind is only able to do one thing at a time, and it deletes off information. Not that the eye didn't catch the image of the gorilla, but the mind just deleted that information altogether. So that is deletion. And it is happening to all of us. Happened to the people sitting in the back row. You couldn't figure out how many people in the room. But your eyeball would have captured every single head in this room, and yet you can't figure out because the number of people in this room, your mind just deleted it away. Just as the way they deleted the gorilla, the image of the gorilla that is moving right across the screen. So it is happening to the best of us. Don't think that, oh, it's only happening in an experiment, it won't happen to me. Are you sure? We're going to find out in a moment whether it will or will not happen to you. Huh? My brother looks just like me. One moment my brother will come and give the talk, and you won't notice. Okay. The next one, or you can even ask Nathan and put on a wig and look like me. Okay, the next one, generalization. Right? We see things and we start to generalize and say, oh, it's the same thing. And it's happening even to the best of us. This condition is called change blindness. There are several conditions. One of them is called change blindness, where someone walks up to the front desk and in the midst of talking to the person behind the front desk, they change to a different person with a different clothes on, different height even, and the person doesn't notice it. So let's take a look at how this is happening even to the best of people in the experiment.
Dan Simons is setting up at a counter where a clerk will converse with volunteers to see how aware they are of their surroundings. Play along with the participants in this one.
What's up, buddy? Good. How are you? All right, real good. I got a form. Let me just grab you a pen.
All right, here we go. All right, now basically all this is a release form.
Okay, stop. Have you noticed anything weird so far? If you didn't, let's run through this one again for you.
I got a form. Let me just grab you a pen.
All right, here we go.
If you caught this one, you may be surprised to find out you're in the minority. Now, let's run this one on a few more people to see just how many of them catch the switch.
Hey, what's up, buddy? How you doing? I just need you to fill out this release form, please. Let me grab you a pen.
Okay, here we go. Go ahead and just sign and date it. So where are you from?
New Jersey.
How you doing today?
Great, how are you?
Real good, real good. I just need you to fill out this release form. Let me grab you a pen, okay?
Okay, here we go.
Let me just grab you a pen for this.
Okay. Making me sign a waiver for this, huh?
All right, here we go. Yeah, absolutely.
None of the next 3 people catch the switch.
Hello.
You may still be doubting that you would fall for this one if you were there in person.
What's your name?
Eva. Eva?
How could you possibly miss a person swapping out mid-conversation in plain view?
Can you describe the person who was here behind the counter?
He had dark hair. I think he had a black shirt on, but I'm not sure.
Can you stand up?
Oh my God, it was him!
And you don't recognize him, though?
No, I've never seen you before.
Okay, he was actually here behind the counter when you first came up to the counter. He's the one who said, I'm gonna duck down and get you a pen.
Oh my God, are you serious? Oh, that's totally embarrassing.
It turns out you don't notice changes like this because you don't expect them to occur.
This condition is called change blindness, where there are certain things that change, and yet we generalize it to be the same thing and we don't notice the changes. So this is generalization. Right? And now let's take a look at distortion, which causes illusions. Right? And in fact, there are 2 types of distortion. One type causes illusion, another type causes delusion. So illusion is the perceptual fallacy. Right? And we can't control it in that sense. Illusion is caused by the way the brain processes it. Right? And let's take a look at the movement of the basketball and figure out how does the basketball move in this picture. Right? So how did the basketball move? Was it flying up in the air? Or was it bouncing on the ground? Or was it rolling in a straight line? Or was it stationary? A, B, C, or D? Right? A. Okay, everybody says A. Right? Everybody agrees? It was flying up in the air. Now let's take a look at the next basketball, which will have a slightly different activity there, right? So how was the basketball moving? Was it flying up in the air, or was it bouncing on the ground? Was it rolling in a straight line, or was it stationary? A, B, C, or D? B, not C. It is bouncing, yeah? Now let's take a look at what really happened, right? What is really happening?
Take a look at this object. One glance and you know what it is. But how do you know what it is and where it's positioned in space? Well, let's break it down. The light reflected by this object is converted by your eyes into an electrical signal and is sent down a neurological pathway called the optic nerve to the back of your brain. Starting in this region, called the visual cortex, the image is cross-referenced with memory of past experiences stored throughout your brain as you try to identify the object. Once it's figured out what it is, your brain has to decide how the object is positioned in space, and one of its most reliable tools is to use shadows. Here's another illusion to show you how that works. Take a look at that basketball again. We're going to put it on the court and move it along a diagonal. Now we're going to add a shadow. It's still moving in the same way, right? Okay. So what if we change the position of the shadow? Do you think we can trick your brain into seeing the ball's motion differently? Does it look like the ball is taking off now? Let's tweak the shadow one more time. What's the ball doing now? Looks like it's bouncing, right? In a world with a single light source, your brain has learned to trust shadows as a near foolproof way to know the behavior of objects in space. And in general, it's worked. Until now.
So we are easily fooled by shadows. Now beware when you're seeing places with shadows. Sometimes you may start to imagine things. And this is why people say, oh, I see ghosts. Oh, there's this lady walking by in the middle, in the dark shadow. Shadows are the worst things that can cause all kinds of delusions. Yeah. Here is another form of distortion. You look at this and it looks like the back of a laptop, right? Yeah? Does it look like the back of a laptop computer? Yeah? The upper side, the cover, is darker, and the base is lighter. True or not? Yeah? So is it true that the cover is darker than the base? Yeah? What happens when I block out the middle? Would you believe that in this image, the upper shade and the lower shade are exactly the same? If you don't believe me, this is what you can do. Close one eye, use your finger horizontally, and block off the middle. Yeah? Now you believe me, huh? Your mind is unable to process this. Yeah? The brain just puts it together, informs the mind what has been perceived. But somehow, because of the past experiences, looking at shadows, the mind begins to interpret the two to have different shades. All because of that thing in the middle, right? If you take that, if you put it there, you will now notice that the two shades are identical. Yeah. So this is another form of distortion. And this is also the result of shadows. And this kind of distortion is really delusional, in the sense that the mind is not able to interpret this accurately. The brain can process it. It is the mind that is unable to interpret it. It's the unconscious mind that is now informing us. Because of past experiences of seeing shadows, it is informing us that the two shades are different. Okay? Now let's look at another kind of distortion in the same way, this time again with shadows. Look at his left hand and his right hand, pointing at two different tiles. Are these two tiles different colors? True or not? The right hand, his right hand is pointing at something which is more like an orange tile. Yeah? His left hand with the watch is pointing at a dark brown tile. True or not? All right? Let's take a look and see. Colors do not exist.
As you're beginning to see, shadows can lie to you, and do all the time.
Behind me, there are two shadows that both appear gray because we have two white lights that are facing me. Now, if we replace with a purple filter, let's see what happens to the colors you see. The shadow no longer looks gray, it looks green. So the question is, where is that green light coming from? Well, there is no green light. The shadow's gray, but it looks green. Why? Because of the color that's surrounding it. Context is everything.
This illusion uses shadow to show you that another one of your most trustworthy sources of information about the world can be faulty. Color.
Light is something that exists in the world. It's a physical thing. And our perceptions and vision begins with light. But color does not exist in the physical world. Color is completely a construct of our brain. In fact, all our perceptions are constructs of the brain. Nothing that we see is, in fact, out there in the world. It seems completely counterintuitive, but color really makes that point.
Colors do not exist out there. Our eyeball is really just picking up light frequency. And then it is the mind that is interpreting this light frequency as different kinds of colors based on past experiences. Yeah? And I'll give you another example, right? And I will skip that one. All right. Now let's take a look at another kind of fallacy, delusion. This is interesting. Huh? This is conceptual fallacy from mental distortion. Remember, we talked about two kinds of fallacy, illusion and delusion. What you have seen just a moment ago is mostly illusion, but let's take a look at delusion. Yeah. Now, we're going to do some mental arithmetic. And Nathan, please participate. Huh? We're going to do some mental arithmetic. Those of you who have seen this before and you know what it is, just allow the others a chance to participate. I'm going to show you some numbers, and I want you to use your conscious, rational mind, your logical mind, to begin to calculate these numbers. I'm going to show you the number, and you're going to say it out loud that it is 1,000, and then you add the next number, so it becomes 1,030. And then you add the next number, it becomes 2,030, and then 2,070. Okay? Let's try that. Are you ready? Let's do that now. Okay? Ready, go. Everybody. 1,000. Good. All right. 70. Okay, good. And then? Oh, that's very good. Now, let's do exactly the same thing. Exactly the same numbers. A little bit faster and a little bit louder. Okay, are you ready? Okay, so let's do it faster and louder, please. Now. 'How many? Okay, first thing you said, how many said 5,000 first? Yeah. You see, you are using your logical mind. You still can't count properly. Yeah? That's really what it is. 4,090 plus 10 is 5,000. Congratulations. Yeah? Thank you, very good. This is actually caused by the hypnotic effect at a logical level of consciousness. Because we are counting in a rhythmic way, two things are happening. It is rhythmic, and because we are concentrating, yeah? But because we are concentrating, the mind can only do one thing at a time. But what is coming up? First, there is numbers being flashed on the screen. So your mind has to figure out what number came up. At the same time, your mind has to add the number together. So it is trying to do two things at the same time. This rhythmic pattern causes hypnotic induction. And all of you hypnotize yourself because of this. So now you realize that even when we look at things around us, everything can hypnotize us if we are not mindful of what we are observing. And be very careful. This is a good warning to all of you. When you are driving on the highway, all these cars whizzing by, what is happening? Rhythmic. It's a rhythmic pattern of activity. And then you're observing the car in the front. And the car in the front is moving at a constant speed. Especially when you're driving on the highway to another city. You can easily be hypnotized. Do be very careful. Yeah? So when you are driving, don't concentrate too much. Concentrate on the driving, yes, pay attention. But switch your view to the car, a few cars in front, can go back to the car right in front of you, take a quick glance at the rear view mirror, do a few things. Don't allow this continuous rhythmic pattern to hypnotize you. So this is a simple little advice to people who are driving, especially outstation. Huh? So I'm not saying take your eyes off the road. Huh? Don't do that. Huh? When you observe the car in front, from time to time, observe a few more cars ahead of you. Then from time to time, very quickly, take a quick peep at the rearview mirror to see what's going on behind you very quickly. Right? So all this can help so that you don't get hypnotized by this rhythmic activity. And in conclusion, I'm going to present to you one last thing to explain another phenomenon, how this sense of self arises. Here is a lady looking at the dog, and this whole thing is an experience. This is the experience of seeing, simple experience of seeing. Seeing depends on various conditions, and one of the conditions is light. If there is no light, complete pitch dark, do you think she can see the dog? No. If this room is completely pitch dark, you can't see me, okay? Because of light, it is reflected from the dog entering her eyeball. And the light entering her eyeball is stimulating the light-sensitive cells in the retina of her eyeball. And this reflected light is what is entering her eyeball, right? And because her eyeball is in good working condition, she's able to see. At the same time, she's paying attention. She's looking at the dog. If she's not looking at the dog and looking somewhere else, she will not be able to see. So paying attention and having working set of eyes, the reflected light from the dog entering the eyeball causes her to see, and then an image of the dog arises in the mind. This is all that has happened. What is it that has happened? She has experienced the seeing of a dog. This is why some of you may have come across this term called, in the experience of seeing, there is only the seeing. Because there is all that is happening. All that is happening is that she is experiencing seeing. But what else is happening in the mind? Something else is happening in the mind. When we see something and a thought arises, I see a dog out there. There is an I. You see, you never talk about these eyeballs see the dog out there. You never think about like that. I see the dog out there. The second key word there is dog. There's an object that is being seen. Out there. It is out there, not in here, not in me. But all that is happening is an experience in me. That's all that is happening, the experience. But the mind tries to interpret it as I am seeing the dog out there. And because of that, the mind projects the idea that, oh, there is this dog out there. And your mind is telling you you're seeing the dog. Is she seeing the dog? She's not seeing the dog. What is she seeing? She's seeing light reflected from the dog. That's all she's seeing. She's not seeing the dog. She is seeing light reflected from the dog. Because light reflected from the dog is the only thing that enters her eye. Not the dog. The dog did not enter her eye. So she can't be seeing the dog. She's actually seeing light reflected from the dog. But the mind begins to process that as I am seeing a dog out there. Now, this I seeing the dog out there is actually breaking this experience into two parts. This process of breaking up is called dichotomization or dichotomy. The dichotomy of experience. Breaking that experience into two parts. One part is the subjective self, whatever is happening inside the mind. The other part is out there, the dog. The dog is out there, the objective world. So it actually breaks an experience into a subjective part and an objective part. But all she's experiencing is just the experience of seeing an image of the dog. But the mind breaks this experience into the subjective self. I am seeing the dog, and an objective world out there. That is how we end up having a notion that there is a self being affected by this conditioning from the environment. That there is a self that is seeing the dog. Right? I am seeing the dog. That's how the sense of self arises, because of this experience and the breaking of that experience. So this is really what is happening to us every day. Right? The illusions, the delusions, the deceptions that are going on. So in conclusion, sensory experiences are dependent on the presence of necessary conditions which are unstable and unreliable. This is anicca. Things are unstable and unreliable. They arise, they fall away. Mind interprets sense experience by referring to memory of past experiences, categorized memory. Remember, what is not in a categorized form that you remember, you cannot recognize, right? Imagination of future outcomes, and this is what leads to fear, right? And expectations of changing the present circumstances. So our imagination, our memory, our expectation is affecting the way we interpret reality. And this interpretation, combined with the mind-body experience, the mind and body are intertwined, right? The mind and the body are intertwined, and this leads to unconscious emotional reactions, which then disturbs the mind. All this is causing disturbances to the mind. This disturbance is dukkha. It is a kind of suffering. And then with this disturbance, it leads to us personalizing the experience and say, I, me, mine, as though there is a self being affected by that experience. And this gives rise to the notion of a self. But what is the reality? The true reality is that our conscious experience are impersonal. Impersonal processes of conditions that are happening, that depend on conditions. So the environment is continuously having activities, right, giving rise to all the conditions, and these conditions is what is causing us to experience them. So in other words, there is no self in this whole process. Everything is impersonal. It is anatta. So this is the important reality we have to understand. That conditions, everything depends on conditions. Conditions are unstable because they arise and fall away, anicca. And all this arising and falling away causes us to interpret with our memory, imagination, expectation. This is why when you learn meditation, you stop using your memory. You stop using your imagination. You stop having expectations. Then your mind can be settled. Your mind can be tranquil. Your mind can be stilled. That stillness of mind is samadhi. Yeah? So meditation helps you to stop all these things, and otherwise you will experience dukkha. Okay? And finally, we always try to personalize every experience and say there is a self to be affected. But there is no self to be affected. Life is anatta. Everything is impersonal. It is just a continuous happening of conditions. Right? With this, I will show you the final slide from the Mangala Sutta, where the Buddha has said, when faced with changing vicissitudes of life, vicissitudes means changing conditions, conditions that are continuously changing. If the mind can be kept undisturbed, that means we don't allow imagination, memory, expectation to disturb what we are perceiving, and free ourselves from these emotional arousals of worry, lust, and fear, this is the supreme bliss. If we are able to maintain that stillness and calmness of mind in a perfect way, we would then be able to have this imperturbable stillness of mind called nibbana. Okay? And that is found in the Mangala Sutta. So thank you for your attention. And with that, I end my presentation.